So how do the indifference curve look like for most goods for most consumers? Well, economists believe that for most goods for most consumers, indifference curves look like this red line. And this is what they call a well-behaved indifference curve. They meet all of the basic assumptions of a rational individual or rational consumer. The important thing to notice here to understand this curve is the slope of the curve and the meaning of it. So when the consumer, in this case, let's say the consumer moved from A to B, gaining one more unit of X. What does the slope means over that period? Well, the slope over that line, or that segment of the line, actually tells you how much this consumer values X, because it tells you how many units of Y he has to give up when he gains X to be equally happy. So for instance, what this is saying is that from that segment A to B, this consumer is willing to give up 2 units of Y, so that will be change of Y over change in X, and there will be 2 units of Y when he gains 1 more unit of X to be equally happy as he was before. So in other words, this consumer value 1 unit of X at 2 Ys. So that's kind of the value this consumer has for X over that line, or that segment, is 2 units of Y. Now let's see when the consumer has a lot more Y, a lot more X. Let's say down here. Let's say this is about, 6. Okay? And let's say this about here is about 4. And let's say this consumer moved from that point to that point, right? A little more X, or 1 more X, and how much Y? Well, let's say this is about 3.5. So what is the slope of the curve from C to D? Well, from C to D, the slope of that curve, which again will be the change in Y over the change in X, will be the change in Y, which was 0.5, over the change in X, which was 1. So how much this consumer values X when he moved from C to D, when he's over that part of the indifference curve, when he has a lot more X? Well, he valued 1X at 0.5 Y. So clearly what this is saying is that this consumer values X a lot less between C and D than it is between A and B. And that is because the slope of this curve is actually decreasing as you move to the right of the horizontal axis, or in the position of D towards more X. Now notice that the same thing happens when you move towards more Y, because the value of the good in the vertical axis will be the inverse of the slope. But the important part here to you to understand is that the slope of this curve gives you the value this consumer has for both goods. And in particular, the direct value of the slope is the value this consumer has for X. And since we're going to be mostly analyzing goods that are in the horizontal axis, this is a very useful thing to know. For instance, consider this. Say I ask you, which of these 2 consumers values the goods in general, the goods in the horizontal axis, the X, a lot more between the 2. So you have 2 consumers, I0 and I1. Which of these 2 consumers show more value for X? Well, since the slope of the indifference curve is the value the consumer has for X, then it must be the consumer in I1 shows that values more X than the consumer in I0, because the slope of I1 is a lot steeper than the slope of I0. And you can also do a little bit of an analysis on the slope to know that. Looking at, for this consumer, when he gains a little bit of X, he needs to give up a lot of Y in order to replace that X and be equally happy. This consumer, when he gains more X, he doesn't have to give up a lot of Y to be equally happy. So clearly this consumer I1, or this indifference curve, represents a consumer that has more value for X than the consumer in I0. So in general, that's something really useful to know. An assumption we're making is that when this indifference curve are in general steeper, they reflect more value for X than where they're flatter.